What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Tim Bridgewater. I have returned for yet another episode of the podcast. If you guys have been listening frequently, you know that this was always something that was potentially going to happen. You know, when I end my podcast, I usually kind of leave them open-ended, and I always say, hey, if there's a reason to come back, then I'll come back. If there's more things to talk about, then I'll come back and talk about them. Or if I get enough emails, I'll come back and I'll read the emails. And what I've realized in recent times is that maybe I've been being a little bit too strict and a little bit too rigid and a little too hard on myself in terms of what it would take to get me to do another episode, right? I think there was a point where I told myself, well, I mean, I did this throughout the history of my previous podcast, of course. And with this one is that something I always say is, if I get enough emails, I'll come back for another episode, right? And then I started to realize, well, what does that mean? Like, how many emails do I need to justify recording another episode of the podcast? Does it have to be 8 emails, 9 emails? Like, does it matter? I think I've been putting a kind of crazy amount of pressure on myself to feel that if I don't have enough content to cover at least an hour, then that means I can't do a new episode of the podcast. But that's just fucking silly, right? I mean, I can come back and do a 20-minute episode and that'll be fine. And these are things that I've been just coming to terms with, taking the pressure off myself and saying that, hey, even if I get 2 emails, that's cool. I can come on, do an episode, read those 2 emails, generate some conversation. And even if it's a 25-minute episode of the podcast, that's still cool. You guys have been probably realizing this for a long time, but I'm just now coming to the realization recently, you know, seeing as how I decided to only cover the first 10 episodes of Dragon Ball Daima. And I said, hey, I'm not really enjoying this show, so I don't want to talk about all 20 episodes. And, you know, as a self-made creator, I have the freedom to do that. So why am I putting so much pressure on myself to come back? Okay, so I'm coming back with another episode because I did get 2 emails and I feel compelled to read those 2 because, for one thing, and this is the most important thing to remember, I appreciate the fact that I still have listeners who sit down, take the time to craft out a well thought out email. You guys are spell checking these emails and everything. You know what I mean? So the least I can do is come back and read your email and talk to you about it and show you my appreciation for the fact that, you know, I don't have a ton of listeners here, but for those of you that do listen, I appreciate you. Okay. So that's just going to be the vibe from this point on. You know, if you send me anything, I mean, it's got to be more than 5 minutes, but if I can get a 10-minute podcast out of it, a 15-minute podcast out of it, I'll still do it. I'll take a little bit of pressure off myself. It doesn't have to be an hour long worth of conversation. Sometimes people have a 10-minute ride to work and they can just enjoy, you know, me talking about a thing for 10 minutes. So I'm going to be a little bit more free form and loose with that as a concept. So that is part of the reason that I'm back. The other part of it is, you know, several of you guys have mentioned the anime Solo Leveling to me. That is an anime that has been mentioned multiple times throughout this podcast specifically. I watched it. I watched Solo Leveling. So I want to talk about that for a little bit. So after we read our 2 emails for our email segment, which is called What Are You Saying? You can send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. I'm going to do a spoiler-free review of Solo Leveling. I'll explain what the show is about. I'll give you my thoughts on it. So if any of you have not watched it, but you've been thinking about watching it, I'm going to give you a review with no spoilers, and I'll tell you my thoughts on it. And then you can, you know, maybe that'll help you decide whether or not you want to check it out or not. But I thought it was important to come on here and mention that I actually watched it, considering, you know, several of you guys actually recommended it to me. Okay, so this is what we're going to do on this episode. I'm going to read 2 emails. I got the first email here from Matthew F. And I've got another email here from Andrew G. We're going to read those, talk about Dragon Ball Daima for a little bit more, maybe close out some of the things that I didn't mention on my previous series wrap-up episode. And then we're going to close out with a brief review of Solo Leveling, okay? So with that being said, let's just go ahead and jump into it now. So once again, What are you saying? Send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. So the first email I got here is from Matthew F. Now, Matthew, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to write in. I don't believe you and I have spoken before. I could be wrong. Sometimes I forget stuff, right? It's possible you wrote in on Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast, and I just forgot, but I feel like maybe this is our first time talking. If that is the case, welcome. Thank you for being a listener. Let's get to your email. Subject line here says, giving thanks. Matthew's email reads, "Hey Tim, messaging again after I had issues with my podcast app, etc. Been meaning to message again since then, but life kinda got in the way. Just caught the series wrap up epi." I guess, yeah, epi is you're basically another word for episode there. I just want to clarify that for any listeners that, it might sound a little weird. And I thought I'd finally share some thoughts out of appreciation for your work and for fun, even if it's a little bit late. I'll try to keep this to the point. Firstly, thank you for the work. That show was not great, so thanks for the great content considering that. I just want to stop for a second and talk about that. Matthew, see, this is what I'm saying, right? I want to come back because it means a lot to me that there are people out there that enjoy listening to me talk about this stuff. And you guys deserve a public thank you and acknowledgement for that from me, So I want to read your emails, even if, I can't get an hour's worth of content out of it by some chance. That's okay, right? Because anyone's going to sit down and take the time to write me, then that's incredible, even after all this time. So first of all, Matt, you're welcome. And I'm still super impressed that anyone wants to sit down and listen to my opinions about anything. So appreciate that. Okay. I think you should definitely finish Dragon Ball just for the sake of it. The ending is the best, and it kind of changed the whole first couple of sagas of DBZ for me, with it feeling like the Saiyan and Frieza saga was the actual ending of Dragon Ball. Okay, we'll just talk about that for a second. Should I finish Dragon Ball? Okay, now that's a good question, right? Because as any of my longtime listeners know that I have not watched the entire Dragon Ball series. Okay, not in its entirety. I've seen some of it. I've seen like key moments, you know what I mean? Like I've gone back and I've watched some of like Goku versus King Piccolo, Goku versus Piccolo Jr., Goku versus Tien, stuff like that. Some of the Red Ribbon Army stuff. Some of the things that are a little bit more notable, So I've seen that, but I've not seen Dragon Ball from start to finish. Ooh, you know what? I might actually take your recommendation on this, okay? Because I didn't mention this at the beginning of the episode, but part of the reason that I watched Solo Leveling, right, is because I already had a Crunchyroll subscription anyway, right, that I got for Dragon Ball Daima. And when Dragon Ball Daima ended, it was right at the same time my subscription to Crunchyroll renewed for another month. So I did cancel it, but I'm paid up through the rest of the month. So I say, well, if I'm going to have this for another 3 weeks, I might as well find something else to watch, right? So that was another reason I decided to go ahead and watch Solo Leveling. Now, with that being said, unless I'm mistaken here, I believe every Dragon Ball series is on Crunchyroll now. Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT, Dragon Ball Super, and Dragon Ball Daima, right? So Dragon Ball, I believe, is on there. And if it's not, it's pretty sure it's on Hulu or something else that I have. So I could watch it. I could. I do have the means to just go and just watch the entire series now. I'm going to look into that. I'm going to think about it. Because it feels a little bit weird that that's the only one of the series that I didn't review. If you listen to, Rock the Dragon Ball Super podcast, clearly I talked about that entire series. And throughout that series, I talked about GT quite a bit. I didn't do a full review of GT, but I talked about it a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about Dragon Ball Z throughout there too. right? And obviously Daima had its own podcast, but Dragon Ball is the only one I haven't really been able to dive into. So maybe I will. I don't know yet. I don't know what kind of commitment I have to another big series, but it does feel a little bit weird that I have not experienced the entire story, right? I've gotten most of it, but I have not gotten the entire story because I have not seen Dragon Ball in its entirety. And you're not the first person to say that it made you appreciate Dragon Ball Z in a different way once you saw that, right? So maybe I will. Okay. Your email continues. I began watching DBZ in dub, but now watch in sub and can't go back. I still hold the sub voice actors in my heart, but it feels more legit / real to me in the sub now. Like the dialogue is more intense. It fits in better with the animation, and some of the characters sound better just personally. And I got used to the high-pitched female voices really quickly. Okay, so we'll talk about that for a second. So you started watching DBZ in the dub, but now you moved over to the sub, and now it's hard for you to go back to the dub. Okay, hey, that's totally fine. You know what I mean? I get a lot of listeners here that prefer the sub version of all this stuff. And there's a huge community of Dragon Ball fans that swear by the sub, live and die by the sub. Their points are just as valid as those of us who enjoy the dub. You know what I mean? Some people prefer their entertainment to be presented to them and they want to absorb it in the way that it was intended in its most natural and organic state. And that may mean watching it with the Japanese voices. And I get that. I understand that. Personally, for me, I don't feel that way. Not when it comes to animation. When it comes to animation, I prefer dub. I mean, I can't, especially with Dragon Ball specifically. I just cannot get down with the Japanese voices. I just don't. I can't stand it. I really can't stand it. That's just my personal, opinion. And I feel like if I'm going to watch animation anyway, the mouths don't match up perfectly regardless. So it's not like that's distracting to me, right? Like it's not like it's distracting that it's an English voice coming out of a Japanese character, because you don't have to really worry about lip flap to that, to that level with animation. Now, what's funny is that when it comes to live action stuff, I feel the opposite. I prefer the sub version when it comes to real people, because then it matters to me. Then it's weird to see an English voice coming out of a mouth where the mouth movements don't match up. Like take, for example, Squid Game, right? I've watched, every season of Squid Game so far, and I watch the subtitle version because I just prefer it there. It's, the emotion that comes across from the actors and all of that stuff, matching with their facial expressions, matching with their mouth movements. I appreciate that much more in live action than I do in animation. But that's just my personal preference, and we're all entitled to our personal preferences on that. So I'm glad you found an appreciation for it. Okay, on to the next part here. It says, as for Daima, I just wanted to ask you what you thought about the idea that the characters acted more like children because they literally had children's brains, so it would be more childlike. Maybe, they were definitely just trying to make it more child friendly, but it's still cool to consider. Okay, so I think that this is something I kind of touched upon in the beginning, right? And that was this idea that even though the way they presented it in the show was that these characters were being turned into kids, but they weren't. Basically, they were just turned into child versions of their adult selves. Right. And the reason why I say that is because they still had all the prior knowledge that they had. It's not like they went back in time and turned them back into kids before they learned everything. They're still the same people. They're just in kids' bodies. Right. So it came across a little bit weird at certain points when, especially with Goku, how he just became a lot more naive and childlike, which he is in general. Right. But it became a lot more in Daima. And I think a little bit of both of these is right. You know what I mean? I think part of it is because they turned them into kids, but the writers felt like they had to make them act sort of like kids. And even though it doesn't really line up with what the story they're trying to tell in this situation, it kind of makes sense that they would do that because, like you said, they were just trying to make it more child friendly because they were turned into kids. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, I definitely, acknowledge the fact that was why. But honestly, I would argue that they mostly only did that with Goku. I don't know if any of the other characters really acted much differently. I don't think Vegeta was that different. I don't think Piccolo was that different. It was really, really apparent with Goku though. So yeah, I definitely consider that. Back to the email. Have you seen the Team 4-star stuff? Sorry, I've covered already. Okay, yeah. Team 4-star. Okay, so no, I have not seen any of the Team 4-star stuff. I feel like this was a question that I got a few times on my previous podcast. Yeah, this is another thing that just comes up pretty frequently for me. People ask me if I've seen that, and I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it, man. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've seen a clip or two, right? But here's the thing about me, and I'm kind of a weird Dragon Ball, snob in this way, I guess, is that when I'm consuming, especially with Dragon Ball Z, I love the Funimation run of Dragon Ball Z so much that anything that makes fun of it or something like that, I know I'm not going to like it. I didn't watch Dragon Ball Z Kai until like last year. You know what I mean? Because I didn't want to watch it because I'm like, well, this is different. Yes, it was Funimation, but it was still, you know what I mean? It's a version that was made without the filler, and they updated the dialogue and they re-recorded everything, and they took some stuff out and changed some stuff around. And nothing against that. I'm glad they made it, and I'm glad 4-star exists, right? Because apparently a lot of you guys enjoyed that. But I personally don't really care for the parody stuff, right? I feel like this is just me, okay? This is just my personal sort of, and I'm not saying it's reasonable, okay? Maybe it's a little bit illogical, maybe it's kind of silly, but I kind of feel like if you're making fun of a show that I love, then I don't care to watch it. That doesn't mean that it's not good. I'm not saying that, but that has been my personal sort of perspective on it. Because I think the whole time I might be like low key sitting there getting pissed off watching it. So I have not seen it, but hey, if I'm gonna go back and watch the original Dragon Ball, maybe I'll watch this stuff. Where can I find this stuff? Because I recall there being some issues with Team 4-star and, Toei and places like that, because I mean, they were essentially, I guess technically it was considered parody and all of this kind of stuff, but I know that there was some legal stuff there regarding, them using something essentially that they didn't own and doing their own dubs and own edits of it. So I don't know. Is that even still available on YouTube now? Or were they forced to kind of stop all that stuff? Okay, back to the email. I recommend a guy on YouTube who does MMA style breakdowns of DBZ and DB fights. It's pretty fun. I think it's called Sensible Saiyan. Okay, look, I'll check that out. I'll check it out. There's one or two Dragon Ball YouTube channels that I will, every now and then a video will pop up and I might watch it a little bit. But for the most part, I don't really, especially because with me doing my own reviews and podcasting about this kind of stuff, I don't like other people's opinions to sort of influence mine. So I don't watch a lot of other stuff like that. But this sounds like something that just might be made for fun, so I'll check it out. Can highly recommend the anime Solo Leveling. It's one of, if not the best anime I've seen. Okay, Matt, got you on that, brother. I got a review coming for you right after we're done with this email segment. Finally, I just wanted to say I feel like part of the reason Dragon Ball Super and Daima have been pretty badly received is to do with the fact that us older OG fans grew up watching one of the greatest, most groundbreaking animes ever. It's like when your favorite band from your childhood releases new music and it just isn't the same. It's something we had during a pivotal moment in our lives, and that time is past. We see a new release by these anime/mans. We get excited that we might get to relive that feeling and moment in time, but it just can't be because things are just different now. And then people say it's the artist's fault. We're going to touch upon that for a second. Because honestly, there's a much bigger conversation here that goes, like you said, like we can apply this ideology to music, movies, TV shows, anything. And that is the fact that the things that we enjoyed when we were younger, there's just a really good chance that we won't enjoy them as much as we get older because we have changed, right? We have grown. Our tastes have changed. Our sensibilities have changed. Like you said, we grew up watching one of the greatest, most groundbreaking, anime ever, and that's Dragon Ball Z. So obviously anything to come after that is going to be hard to top. And this is something I touch upon quite a bit. A lot of our feelings and love for this stuff comes from a place of nostalgia, right? Like, I don't think by any means that He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, the one that I grew up watching, is a good show. If I go back and watch that now, I'm pretty sure it's not that great, right? But I still have so much love for it from a nostalgic perspective because I grew up watching it, and that was one of the shows that I was really into as a kid. And so we can say the same thing about Dragon Ball. And that could be a part of the reason why DBS and Daima have been badly received is yes, because we have changed and, maybe our expectations for things have changed. And it's just never going to be the same because that was something that was really, really important to us at that point in time. And, it's hard to top that now. But I would say that is a part of it, 100%. But I would also argue that the other part of it is that those shows are just not good. And what I mean by that is they are different, right? Like Dragon Ball Super is noticeably different from Dragon Ball Z. I mean, it's not nearly as violent. It's not nearly as, the stakes seem to be non-existent. The suspense, for the most part, seems to be non-existent. Look, the Tournament of Power was pretty impressive, right? But I think everything that came before that was questionable. And for me, the Goku Black stuff was when it started to really kind of get into an interesting area. But everything before that with Resurrection of Frieza and Beerus, I mean, I would say that most of that stuff wasn't very good. And it wasn't because, I've grown up. It's because I think you can list out the noticeable differences between Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super. And once again, violence, stakes, power scaling, transformations just getting completely out of control and more ridiculous and essentially becoming easier to achieve and not meaning anything. No filler, which I would argue that a lot of the filler, even though a lot of us, thought we didn't like it, in Dragon Ball Z actually helped Dragon Ball Z. I mean, think about it. You know what I mean? A single fight would take 6 or 7 episodes or 8 episodes. And that seems kind of silly now to think about. But at the time, because we spent so much time with those characters, by the time that fight ended, it felt like an epic fight. Because while they were standing there talking to each other, they were creating suspense. You know what I mean? Suspense. Like it was, building to a fight. Whereas in Super and Daima, they'll introduce a villain and it almost seems like it was so fast that when it was time for the final battle, it didn't really mean anything. Certainly in Daima, it felt that way for me. So I would argue that those noticeable differences, the things that we think about that made Dragon Ball Z so unique, and we even make fun of those things to an extent, are also part of the reason why it was so great, because we still loved it. Right? So clearly those things were not that big of a problem. So I would say that there were actual differences and choices that were made. And some of this, may depend on how much Toriyama was involved too, right? So I think you're right. I think a lot of it is nostalgia, but also a lot of it is just the solidified, definitive differences between the way that show was made and produced and handled, and because it had a very, very serious tone. Dragon Ball Z, yeah, it had some silly stuff in there, but for the most part, it was pretty serious. I mean, people getting their limbs chopped off, characters getting killed and wished back to life, planets getting blown up, people being tortured. You know what I mean? Transformations held weight. They felt important. They felt earned, with the exception of Goten and Trunks. Okay, little Trunks. My goodness, Gohan going Super Saiyan level 2 meant something, right? They built to that. Cell and purposefully dug at Gohan to get him to that point. They were building suspense, anticipation. Those were stakes. And then when we got that payoff, it was incredible, right? I just think they don't do that in these modern day Dragon Ball shows. So I think you're right, but I don't think that's all of it, but I do think that that's a very important aspect of it too. Okay. Last part of the email here, Toriyama passing drove that home for me, which is what was so sad personally. I knew that time was over. It bookended that period. I felt that at the end of Daima too, knowing that it was the very last thing of this era of my life in which the one responsible for such a great, important, and sentimental piece of work, Toriyama, had part in. After all, though, I think it's something to celebrate, getting to grow up with such awesomeness. I hope that makes sense. Of course, yeah, and I kind of touched upon Toriyama there in a while. It feels it's kind of sad that this was Toriyama's last Dragon Ball related thing, to our knowledge. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if next year something else came out and said, oh no, Toriyama had a hand in this too. I mean, but my thing is this. At this point, we don't know how much involvement Toriyama really has in this kind of stuff and had, you know what I mean? Because at some point, inevitably with these creators, and it's sad to think about it like this, but it also happened with Stan Lee, is that the older he got, the less power he had. It became this machine that he couldn't control anymore. And he kind of just became like this figurehead, face of the company, who didn't really have any power, but they needed his face and name to be associated with it to give it a certain level of legitimacy. And I don't know if that was the case with Toriyama or not, because they can tell us that Toriyama had a big hand in Daima and it was his ideas and character designs and all that stuff, but you can't find anything that even verifies that. So, but I understand what you're saying. The best of Akira Toriyama, in my opinion, was Dragon Ball Z. So, I'll always remember him for that, for sure. Rest in peace, Toriyama. Anyway, thanks again for the epic job. It's appreciated and enjoyed. P.S. Feel free to not read this whole email out if you ever do another show, but also go for it. Haha. Thanks, Matt. Okay, Matt. Well, obviously I read it, man, and I appreciate the content. And I appreciate you being a listener and taking the time to send that in. It's a well thought out email that deserved a response. So it's a big part of the reason I decided to come back and do another episode. Okay, so we're going to jump over to our other email here, which is from Andrew G., one of my longtime listeners. It says here in the subject line, final thoughts. Hola, Tim. Glad to see you did a final episode. I feel very similarly to you. I didn't really like the rest of the episodes until the last 3, and I only really enjoyed the final episode. The animation and action to me had Dragon Ball superhero vibes, and I was digging it. Like you, I was spoiled on Super Saiyan 4 popping up. I enjoyed it for what it was. I don't care much about the continuity at this point, even though it is definitely frustrating. And I agree that the series has turned into mostly just new, unearned transformations, which is lazy writing for sure, but honestly, if I watched a DBZ movie or season nowadays, if I watched a new DBZ movie or season nowadays, I feel like I would be disappointed if there wasn't a new one. The old DBZ movies did just fine without new transformations though, so I think the writers could do it if they could just find the right stakes. Okay, so I'm going to touch upon that for a minute here, Andrew. I want to talk, the unearned transformations, right? But then you said something else that's really interesting here to me. And that is, if you watched a new DBZ movie or season nowadays, you would be disappointed if there wasn't one. Okay, and I think that's the reason why they keep doing this. I think we've gotten to a point now to where everyone expects there to be new transformations with every movie or new series. And I mean, I don't know if that's right or not. I mean, how do you guys feel about it? Yeah, but for me, I've gotten to the point where I expect it, but I don't necessarily think that I need it, right? I would much prefer there just be an interesting story being told rather than someone reaching a new level of power, because it's just becoming more and more repetitive, right? Every series, someone reaches a new level of power. And it, I mean, and even in the movies, they've started to do this, right? But if we look at the old DBZ movies, they would have several movies where Goku would just power up to Super Saiyan. He didn't have to reach a new level of power in every movie. They would just find a creative way to make him have to hold out and save that his transformation to the very end of the film or something like that, as opposed to him having to reach a new level of power, which is what they've, we were talking about Dragon Ball Superhero and how the transformations, Beast Gohan, Orange Piccolo, they feel a bit fan servicey to me. I appreciated what happened in those moments visually and all of that. But I mean, they were basically just trying to recreate Gohan going Super Saiyan level 2 there. I mean, to the point to where they literally like animated it the same way. That's kind of lazy to me. You know what I mean? So I don't really care for this idea of just getting transformations for the sake of getting transformations just because we expect them to happen. And I think it's a kind of a dangerous place to be in from a writing perspective, to allow yourself to be beholden to something like that. Because I think that they're thinking, well, yeah, they're going to need a new transformation in this series. And a lot of us, we don't need that. Just go back to some good storytelling and have some stakes. And, I think putting a limit on everyone's abilities at this point would actually be a good idea. So I thought that was interesting that you mentioned that. So it would be a little bit weird for sure if there wasn't one, but that weirdness might just be the thing that we need to get this world to be a little bit more interesting the way that it used to be. Okay, back to your email. I was a little bummed you didn't mention what I feel like is the top 3 most humorous moments in Dragon Ball media, where Bulma threatens Vegeta with no more baths together, and he immediately flies down and hands it over to Goku. I thought that was absolute gold, and it's probably my only memorable part about this show. Okay, yeah, so I definitely forgot to mention that in my previous review. You know what, Andrew, I'm gonna be honest with you, man. I didn't really like it. I didn't like it. From a comedic perspective, was it funny? Sure. Is this the kind of thing that would happen in Dragon Ball world? Certainly, right? They've established this type of humor as being a thing that would happen. But I don't care for when they do it in a situation where like the stakes are supposed to be real or serious. And the fact that they chose to do that in the moment that they did just made me feel even more so that the stakes in this Daima just didn't mean anything, that they weren't real. You know what I mean? That this is a show that was just made just for the hell of it and fun, and which would have been completely fine if it wasn't considered canon. But the fact that they decided to call it canon for me is what doesn't ring right with me. So I didn't appreciate it, to be honest with you, because I don't think for one second that Vegeta would choose sex with Bulma over a fight with a villain. You know what I mean? His pride as a Saiyan and as a warrior has always trumped that kind of stuff. So for them all of a sudden this moment to say that, Vegeta's going to back out of this fight because he's threatened to not have bath time with his wife anymore. It just seemed kind of silly. Don't get me wrong. It was funny, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, right? This is something I talked about in a previous episode. modern Dragon Ball is different from old school Dragon Ball. And I think once we get to the point to where we can kind of accept that, then this kind of stuff won't bother us as much as it does now, or bother me in this case, right? But modern day Vegeta, you know, does karaoke and all this other shit and dances, and they had him do some crazy stuff like that in one of those movies. I think it might have been Resurrection F, right? But I mean, we're talking about the same Vegeta that, you know, would have rather die than, you know, be shown up by someone else. That's how important his pride is to him as a fighter. So why would he back down at a risk of not getting, you know, taking a bath with his wife, right? Once again, I'm probably reading too much into it, but this is just coming from an old school Dragon Ball fan where that just didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like something that he would do. I mean, my goodness, dude, like Vegeta's pride was so strong that Trunks felt like he had to wait until Vegeta was knocked unconscious before he even powered up to show that he had temporarily, quote unquote, gotten stronger than his father. Remember that back in the Cell games? You know, Trunks was like, I can't even unleash my full power because my father's pride is so strong that he'll just, you know, freak out. So I got to wait until he's knocked unconscious. So it doesn't make sense that he would back down from a fight for something like this. But, you know, that's just how I read it. Let's see. Okay. To me, hearing Sean Schemmel and Christopher Sabat's voices again at the end was a huge breath of fresh air. Not that the other voices were bad, but their voices are so iconic and familiar in a nostalgic way that part of it just didn't feel like Dragon Ball without hearing them. I agree with that. That's pretty much all of my thoughts. Glad to see you close out the podcast. I don't know about a future DBZ podcast, but the Avatar 7 Havens animated show was announced a couple months ago. Earthbending Avatar after Korra. No idea when it's coming out, but I think you could get some real traction on a show like that if you started the podcast at the beginning. All the best and good luck with everything, Andrew G. Andrew, long-time listener, man. Always great to hear from you. I appreciate that. Yeah, as far as the future goes with me with more podcasting, you know, I'll kind of take it one day at a time. I'll see what happens. I did hear about that show. For those of you who may not be aware, I did host another podcast called Republic City Report, where I reviewed and covered The Legend of Korra, which was the successor to Avatar: The Last Airbender. So if you're someone who's getting into that right now, I have a whole other podcast that you can go listen to where I talk about that. So that's what Andrew's referencing here. The fact that there's a new Avatar show has been announced with several other announcements. I mean, there's a movie coming, there's this new show, there's a lot more Avatar world stuff coming. I mean, they decided to open a whole new studio dedicated to Avatar projects. So is that something I want to dive back into as a podcaster? I don't know yet. Only time will tell. All I know is that it's hard to commit to stuff like that because it's just a lot of material to cover. And I personally haven't been seeing enough of a response to kind of justify getting back into that kind of thing. But, you know, time will tell and we'll see. But I'm always appreciative to those of you that would like to hear it from me, you know. So Andrew, as always, man, thank you so much for writing in. With that being said, it's time to switch over now. Of course, if you have anything you'd like to say about anything pertaining to what we just talked about, you can send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. And you know, I'll come back and I'll talk about it more if I feel like it's something that can generate some conversation. That being said, we're going to switch on over to a quick, brief review of Solo Leveling. All right. Once again, I'm mostly going to talk about this because, you know, some of you guys have recommended it to me. So stands the reason you might be interested in my opinions on it. Okay. So Solo Leveling. So if this is something that this will be a spoiler-free sort of a thing, because I know that a lot of people probably haven't watched this yet and you're probably considering it. So I'm not going to spoil anything for you. But I will say this, you can currently watch both seasons. It's only 2 seasons of Solo Leveling. I think they're about 23, 24 episodes apiece. Currently available on Crunchyroll, dubbed and subbed. Okay, so whichever you prefer, you can pick. I watched the dub, of course. Very, very happy I watched the dub. This actually ties in the Dragon Ball Daima here because, and I didn't realize this going into it, but there's a couple of Dragon Ball actors that are part of Solo Leveling. Most noticeably, Christopher Sabat, okay, who was obviously the voice of Vegeta, Piccolo, Yamcha, he's a character on this show. Also, Ian Sinclair, who was the voice actor for Whis, is also on this show. And I didn't know that going into it. I recognized the voices. Christopher Sabat has a very, very distinguishable voice. You know what I mean? So when I heard him, I said, I didn't know he was in this. And Ian Sinclair as Whis, was awesome too. So he's also in this. And there could be more. I'm sure there are. I feel like maybe I heard Johnny Young Bosch in there somewhere, who's obviously not a Dragon Ball actor. No, wait a second. Johnny Young Bosch is a Dragon Ball actor. He was the voice of Broly, right? And the new Broly. So that's 3 Dragon Ball actors in there, and there are probably more, but I didn't look it up, right? Anyway, so that was a nice surprise. So Solo Leveling, the general sort of idea of the show is this, and the reason I'm gonna go into this is in case someone wants to go check it out based on this. It takes place in a world where all of a sudden these portals show up across the earth. And in these portals come these creatures they call magic beasts. Okay, so basically creatures and monsters and stuff like that. So they start coming out, basically they start attacking people, killing people on earth and etc. And it's sort of a natural evolution. A lot of human beings start to develop abilities. Right? So you can think about it like mutants in the X-Men or something like that. Just random people across the planet start to develop powers, right? And so they develop ways to sort of test the amount of power that these humans have evolved. And as a result of that, they're able to place each human with powers in a certain class. So they develop this ranking system of S rank, A rank, I think C rank and E rank. I kind of forget the ranks. I'm sorry, I'm kind of messing that up. But there are classes of powers, right? So there's a lot of, there's only a handful of S rank people. They're called hunters, right? They call themselves hunters at this point. So these humans that develop abilities called hunters, and they rank them by class. So S rank, and you could be A rank, or you can be E rank, which is the lowest rank. I'm probably forgetting something in there too. But our main character is a character named Jinu Sung, who's an E rank hunter. So he's basically the weakest hunter around. He's one of the weakest ones around, right? And it's also understood that once you become a hunter, once you develop abilities, that once your rank is set, if you're A rank, you're just an A rank. That's it. There's no way to level up or get stronger or anything like that. Your power abilities will remain the same. That's just what you are, because they've established this over time, right? Our main character develops the unique ability to be able to level up his abilities. Okay, no one else at this point can do this, right? So he can level up. So he starts as an E rank, and then he can level up from that point on. How's he able to do this? Well, that's kind of one of the mysteries of the show. And not only can he do this, he does it in a way that is very video game like, right? And what I mean by that is he actually gets like a little notification pop up that lets him pick his abilities, tracks the amount of points that he gets every time he kills a beast. And he can level up, and he gets rewards and bonuses and stuff like this. So it's very much like an RPG sort of a thing, but in their case, in real life, because he can actually level up the way a video game character would level up. So he can, select his inventory, get different weapons, He gets power-ups and bonuses and skill boosts and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, it happens in a way that is literally like a video game because he gets to select it from an actual screen that he can see in front of his face. Okay. So, obviously if this type of thing would happen in real life by some chance, it would be politicized. It will be militarized. It will be corporatized to some extent. Right. So in this world, becoming a hunter and killing these magic beasts becomes sort of like a career. It's an industry, essentially, because they develop these guilds that are sort of like these corporatized, like privatized militias, more or less, of like mercenaries, but they're not mercenaries really because they're essentially mercenaries because they're being hired to go and fight. You know what I mean? So there are different guilds. So the whole time there's sort of this political corporate sort of B level story that's kind of happening at the same time throughout this. But the main story is following our main character who's leveling himself up and finding different ways to do it. And part of the excitement of it is just being able to see what is he going to do next? How is he going to reach the next level? And it's just a very, very creative way of telling a story like this. Because we've seen a lot of stories where monsters show up and people have to kill them and come together and stuff like this. But the way it happens here is just very, very unique, I think. And another thing is that, you know, these portals that open up, they're called gates on the show. And so they will dispatch, a certain guild might dispatch their hunters to go and clear this gate. Because the idea is they're going to go through the gate and kill all the monsters before they have a chance to come out. It's very much like a video game, right? There are these minions, and then each gate has a boss. And once they defeat the boss, the gate closes, right? So there are these, you know, and inside their gates, there are these dungeons. They call them dungeons. And then another thing is that they can go in there in these dungeons, and these dungeons will have certain resources. Like there may be some crystals in there. There are these stones. These magic beasts leave behind these elements that can be used in the outside world to make money, contribute to resources and stuff like that. So it's a whole corporatized sort of industry. Not only are they protecting the earth, but like, you know, this is some people's jobs. You know, they'll pick up a freelance job going help clear this gate with these monsters in it. So that's what Jinu's song kind of falls in. But once again, the unique ability that he has is that he's able to level himself up when no one else can, essentially. So they're all really, really surprised that it's like, wow, how he started as an E rank and now he's I'm not going to spoil anything, but that is the point, is that he's able to level himself up with ability wise. So it's very interesting to watch him change from being this tiny E rank hunter at the beginning and then evolving into what he becomes in the end. Okay, so that's more or less what the show is about. Now for my actual review of it, I thought this show was awesome. I had a really, really good time watching Solo Leveling. I'll say this though, because nothing's perfect, right? While there is a lot of really great animation in this show, I would say that I had a very hard time, and I'm curious to see if anyone else feels this way. I had a very hard time following the action in a lot of those fights. I just feel like the way it's animated is so quick and so flashy that you can't really tell what's happening half the time. You know, there's some really cool shit happening. You know that. There's blood splattering everywhere. There's lights flashing all over the place. And look, and it's just an anime thing. So I know it's not just this show. But, you know, my specific sort of critique of that would be that I would like to be able to see what's happening more, because it's very, very hard to follow the action throughout a lot of it. As cool as it may look. I was a little bit worried because with the main character, when he starts to level up and as time passes, he has a physical change that he goes through. He gets taller, stronger, all that kind of stuff. But his personality also kind of changes. And for a minute there, I was worried. I was like, I don't know if I like him. You know what I mean? I was like, I don't know if I like this character at this point, because the more he leveled up, the more he started to kind of feel like a pompous kind of, you know, egotistical. Like for a minute, he was starting to kind of feel that way. But then they kind of, I don't know, they leveled him out, and now I really like him. You know what I mean? So I was a little bit worried for a second. I was like, oh, I feel like they're creating a little bit of an unlikable character, because it seems like he's becoming kind of a stuck up douchebag after a while. But that doesn't last very long. I think it came across pretty well in the end. I mean, look, I enjoy the show. I can't say that I was able to follow everything that was going on, because I mean, unless you watch it, sometimes even though you're watching the dub, you still need to put the subtitles on, right? Because sometimes it's just hard to hear stuff, and that was happening to me quite a bit. So there's some stuff I missed. A lot of the stuff with the guilds and the political stuff kind of happening in the background, I didn't really absorb all of that. And I'm not sure it was that interesting, to be honest. I mean, it was cool, but the cool stuff is obviously following Genu, around and all of that. His leveling up, his personal kind of stakes, his personal experiences with him and the people around him. I think that's cool. I do think that they are going to run into a problem here that a lot of anime seems to run into, including Dragon Ball Z, or just Dragon Ball in general. And that is having a character that your main character be OP. Okay. OP as fuck. All right. And for anyone who may not be familiar with that phrase, means overpowered. Because he, by the end of this thing, he's leveled up so much to the point to where it starts to be like, okay, there's got to be a ceiling here, right? You have to have stakes. You have to have a threat. You have to have someone who comes along that, puts a limit on those abilities. And right now it's kind of hard to see that, but there's only 2 seasons, you know what I mean? And I the way season 2 kind of ends, that may be happening. They may be, kind of lending itself toward that, but the series doesn't really, I don't know if there was I don't know if I ever felt for 1 minute that he would not make it through a battle, because they've kind of established him to, he gets so powerful at a certain point to where it's like, you're just waiting for him to for that moment to turn where he just figures it out and he wins, but I mean, I guess you could say that about a lot of stories with the main character, but look, it wasn't intended to be a very, very long, review of Solo Leveling. And I can't get into too much detail without spoiling stuff, but I did at least want to touch upon it for a little bit for my listeners that, recommended it and asked me about it. And I just want to say that I did watch it. I definitely enjoyed it. I guess there's been no official confirmation on the season 3 of it at this point. But I feel like it's pretty safe to assume they're going to continue with it, because the reaction seems to be pretty good with this show. So if you're considering watching Solo Leveling, it comes highly recommended from me. If you're someone who, values my opinion on stuff. So I'd say check it out. I can't get too much more into it, once again, without spoilers and all that kind of stuff, but I did want to talk about it. I'm just thinking for a second here to make sure there wasn't anything else I wanted to touch on. No, that about does it. Okay, so this very well could be the final episode of the podcast, and maybe it won't be. I'm going to be a little bit more loose with this, free form. I'm not going to put so much pressure on myself. If you want to see me an email, and if I feel like it's one that'll generate at least 10 minutes of conversation, I can come back with another episode of the podcast. As long as you guys are listening and you're interested, I'm down to have conversations. So with that being said, I'm not going to say farewell, because this doesn't have to be the end, basically. So I'm just going to say see you later. So with that being said, for this episode of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast, I'm your host, Tim Bridgewater. Thank you guys for sticking around and coming back and being patient and just being loyal, faithful listeners. So I'm going to say, until next time, keep on rocking the dragon. Yeah.